I now welcome Sue back again to offer our morning reading.
The reading this morning is entitled, Where Do We Go From Here? It's an extract from Dr. King's last Southern Christian Leadership Conference presidential address. There's nothing wrong with power if power is used correctly. And one of the great problems of history is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites, so that love is identified as the resignation of power and power with the denial of love. Now, power properly understood is nothing but the ability to achieve a purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is the power of correcting everything that stands against love. So ends the reading.
Thank you, Sue. I now invite you to sit back and enjoy the wonderful special music prepared by Molly Webster, Stephen Bouchard, Chris Childs, Brittany Smith as well.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall
thank you for everyone who collaborated on that video. In addition to there we go, we got all the photographers too who shared their photography from that wonderful rally here in Bangor. And thank you to Karen Childs, who is the Honey Buzz Studio, for her putting the music and the pictures together in such a beautiful and touching way. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm going to wait a minute here as we make the transfer over to being spotlighted. There we go. So today we celebrate the birthday of the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. He is best known as the public face of our country's civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. His commitment to racial justice and social change was immense, and his leadership, especially his talent for public speaking and organizing, was great. His charisma and gifts were so powerful and uplifting that he is, I believe, probably quoted more often on the topic of social and racial justice than maybe any other American that we know. When I think of King, I imagine boycotts, bus boycotts, the March on Selma, the I Have a Dream speech, and his letter from the Birmingham jail. He was a leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that was involved with the 1963 March for Jobs and Freedom that I talked about earlier. A march that at its time was one of the largest marches in our nation's history, where over 250,000 protesters rallied to draw attention to the continuing challenges of inequality faced by Black people in our country. Most of what we know about the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is his public persona. We appropriately hold up his many lists of accomplishments as being exemplary, and we also tend to put him a bit on a pedestal and make him the king of civil rights. But we often forget the tens of thousands of students, activists, churchgoers, clergy, and local organizers who made the significant contributions to that movement as well. They all deserve recognition. We also know that just like any public figure, King had a private life, one that is not often discussed in our remembrances of him. I think we do this because we like to think of our heroes in absolute terms. However, I think there is also an important lesson to look at that humanness of our heroes. It helps us recognize our connection to humanity and the blessed messiness that working for social justice can sometimes bring. In his book, The Death of a King, author Tavis Smiley offers a behind-the-scenes perspective on King's last year of life. From his delivery of the famous Beyond Vietnam speech in April 4th, 1967, till his assassination approximately a year later. Examining King's life in that last year, Tavis Smiley observes that if King had not been shot, there is a possibility that he might have driven himself to death because the tremendous amount of pressure that he was under that last year of his life, brought on by a whole slew of stressors. Perhaps the biggest was the fallout from his Beyond Vietnam speech, where he questioned the connection between an unjust war and the military-industrial complex that sent poor people of color to their deaths. As a result of that speech, many of his allies backed away from King. They thought that he was taking things too far. The civil rights movement was one thing, but questioning capitalism and militarism were just too much. As a result, he lost a ton of support for his Poor People's Campaign. To make up the difference, King worked harder and took on even more speaking engagements to raise money, which led to more time on the road away from his family and friends. He also continued receiving threatening messages and started feeling a lot of isolation from some of his dearest associates who literally shunned him. He grew anxious and alone. All these increased pressures also took a toll on his health. He started drinking, smoking, he had an affair, he had several panic attacks that left him unable to leave his house for days at a time. His closest and most loyal friends who continued to support him encouraged King to seek out professional and mental health support. But King refused, out of fear that the people who were trying to silence him would use that to discredit his prophetic ministry. He continued to work at a frantic pace despite the toll that it was taking on his health, his family, and his mental and spiritual well-being. The king of nonviolence was actually acting violently towards himself. This is another side of King's legacy. It's an important part to be aware of. Now, I don't want to distract from the 99% of the things that he did do that were nonviolent and powerful. But we also know that it is imperative as we continue to work for justice, that justice is a process. And it is therefore not just about what we do, but how we go about doing it that matters. We know that because it is a process, it does not have an ending, and so we need to keep working onward and onward and onward, which can be very grueling and challenging at times, especially after the last 4 years. We also know that we need to remain informed, engaged, and vigilant to make real change happen. This is not something that we can just do occasionally. This work of social justice and working for equality is something that is part of our lives. It is part of our DNA, especially as Unitarian Universalists. It is not easy to do, and that is why it is essential that if we are to work for justice and continue to work in a way that is meaningful and matters and sustainable, we need to do several things. We need to continue working for social justice in a way that is sustainable, that allows us to continue our work throughout our whole lives. To achieve this, we need to maintain a balance of work, social justice work, self-care, and relationships with our families. To do this work, we need to continually and effectively we build relationships and find cool collaborators. Social justice work is about relationships and maintaining those relationships. If we learn to work together, we can also learn and find the excitement, the joy, the love, and the power that accompanies that struggle, which in itself is renewing. Working together makes our efforts lighter and more sustainable. When I see in those pictures children at rallies, and I hear people speaking and telling stories and other people listening to other people's stories of injustice, we are building community, connection, and hope. One of the places that I've been feeling a lot of that hope lately is in our Soul Searchers group, where we continue to look inward at our own privilege and our own constructs of white supremacy that we have kind of taken on by just being people in our modern society. I've learned a lot from that group and continue to be transformed by the conversations and the sharing that happens at those meetings. The second thing we need to do this work is imagination. Finding new and engaging ways to connect and build community is so important, especially in the middle of a pandemic. And it is amazing to me how, even though we have probably the most variety of ways of communicating that humanity has ever had, we still have problems communicating across racial, economic, international, regional, intergenerational, and even gender and gender identity lines. Finally, we need to accept that working for justice is going to make us uncomfortable. To be effective agents for social change, we need to develop the skills to live in mental, spiritual, and perhaps even physical discomfort. One of the reasons I think that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was so successful in what he did was that he had a spiritual grounding that allowed him to endure the suffering that came with the struggle for justice. Through spiritual practices like prayer, reflection, meditation, and his colleagues, even in the most trying moments, he was able to find profound meaning, perspective, and solace. It wasn't until he lost that connection and grounding that he became so miserable. It's also crucial for us to remember that many of the world's changes are the result of our ancestors working for change through their faith that has moved us forward, even through times when even though times feels like many of those things that they had accomplished have been taken away, or we've had to step back from some of those accomplishments. In the coming years, we have much to do to earn our stripes as ancestors, to undo the damage and harm that has been done over the course of the last 4 years, especially on the federal level. But there is still much to do both on the state and local level as well. One of the things that I am excited to hear more about is that my understanding is that the state legislature is working on this session to put together a bill, LD2, which is supposed to be a bill that will require every piece of legislation in the state of Maine to include a reflection on how it affects Indigenous people, people of color, and people from different social economic paradigms in our state. I encourage you to keep checking the news and the MUSON, the Maine UU Social Advocacy Network website, for more information on this bill and many other bills that will be coming through our state legislature this year. So as we remember the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., let us remember that part of our faith calls us to work for justice, to work for the inherent worth and dignity of all people. Let us hold in our hearts and channel that energy of King when things were going good and things were healthy, and be mindful to not burn ourselves out and to reach out and help each other as we continue the struggle. I will conclude with a line from our closing song. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We need to keep working. We need to be vigilant. We will lose our edge and effectiveness. But if we allow ourselves to get burned out or become isolated or to not stick with nonviolent methods, we are going to create more havoc and more damage that will need to be undone. So let us help each other stay woke and energized in this effort, for the struggle of justice remains relevant no matter how long the arc of the universe is. Blessed be, and amen.